Okay, is this thing on? Alright, take two of doing stuff for the VHW game. So you might have looked at these rules here and think, wow, this is very complicated because I, in fact, split this into 5 messages. But hopefully this video will show you that it's not that bad, right? I hope it's not that bad. Okay, so this is from the previous take of the video, just ignore that. Oh, yeah. Okay, Google Sheets moment. So yeah, just ignore that. There wasn't anything there. Okay, so let's go through the rules one by one, and I'll tell you what they mean. Rule number one, here's a 13 by 13 board. That's simple enough, right? Okay, rule number two. This is where things start getting slightly complicated. But basically, you just gotta DM me a list of things. You just gotta list me, give me a list of squares, saying which squares you want to spawn your pawns in. So for example, you might want to spawn near the center because that's kind of valuable because it's near the flag. So you might want to have a spawn like G7, G8, H7, H8, E7, E8, I7, I8, E7, and E8. And this is the kind of list you'd give to me. Rule 2 works with rule number 3, and they both determine how pawns are spawned. So let's say this is player A here, and this is player B here, and they both, by complete coincidence, went for the same squares. How would that happen? I don't know. Let's say that player A invested 20 credits into being first, but player B only invested 10 credits in having a spawn priority. In this case, the spawn order would go A B A B A B A B, and for the sake of simplicity, let's say they each have 8 pawns. So I'd go through their lists here, and then I'd see. Well, we're starting with A. The first square they list is G7, and G7's unoccupied, so I occupy that square with A's pawn. B. B goes next. G7's occupied with A. G8 is not occupied, so we'll go with that. And then we repeat that process for every single pawn. But once we get here, we're in a bit of a predicament here, because now all of the squares that they have listed are gone, but each of them still have 3 pawns to add. So in that case, I just put their pawns in random positions. Yeah, so make sure to list a lot of squares, otherwise you might have some pawns landing in random spaces. Continuing with how the board starts in the beginning, rule number 4 tells you about wastes, which are squares that you cannot move into, which are these represented by black squares. So they get spawned in 10 random locations, but in our case, let's just say they spawn in 3 locations. And then they'd have like a bit of a 3x3 area because rule 4a says that when a waste is spawned, it also spawns in all adjacent squares. So it'd go like this all around it. This would also go all around it as well. However, it would only spread to unoccupied squares. So this waste here could only spawn in these squares because these 2 squares are occupied by pawns A and B. Rule 5 and Rule 6 are basically the ones that are actually important because they tell you how pawns move, and movement's in basically the entire thing of the game. I'll cover Rule 7 as well, but the rest of this I'm not going to bother with. You can just read that. Rule number 5 tells you how this this important? This isn't important. Okay. That's not important. I don't have to restart the video. Okay. Uh, Rule number 5, a player may move their ready pawns by saying in the game channel a message. So right over here, let's say A wants to move their pawn from f7 to f6. They would make a command in the game channel. They would text something like x1, f7, f6. And what that tells me is that you just want to make a move from f7 to f6. So when you send that, it goes from here over to here, and that's that. There are more specific parts of this. For example, after moving, a pawn becomes vulnerable, and when a pawn is vulnerable, it cannot move. It is also easier to attack. A pawn becomes vulnerable for 20 minutes. So right now it's 6:37 p.m. where I'm at. So that means that on 6:57, it'll become ready again. And you might notice this thing over here. I listed it as A01. And what that just means is how many pawns there are ready and how many pawns there are in total. So A11 would just mean there's pawn owned by A. There is one ready pawn out of one pawns. So it basically means all the pawns are ready, there's one pawn. If it says something like 01, it means there's pawns there owned by A. 0 of the pawns are ready, but there is one pawn there. Basically means there's one vulnerable pawn. Says something like 1-2 means there's one ready pawn, 2 pawns in total, which means there's one ready pawn and one vulnerable pawn. So the first number means how many ready pawns there are, and the second number means how many pawns there are in total. So that's how my writing works there. C just says all the situations where moves are invalid. D says you can put multiple moves in a message. Multiple moves in a message would look something like this. I would suggest that you put them in different lines, like that. Like press Shift plus Enter after every single move. It makes it easier for me to read. And then if you send me multiple moves at once, I would resolve them in order like this. And you could have multiple moves at once so people can't interrupt you mid-move. And that's kind of neat to have. We're at 8 minutes, so we're almost done here. 6 just says that pawns can generally only move one square away from it. So it'd be like, if you have a pawn that's right here, you can move here, 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 here. And there are some exceptions to that. First of all, you are not allowed to move into these black squares because they are meant to be obstacles, but you are allowed to move into pawns that contain a friendly pawn. So if A wanted to move over here, he can move there, and there'd become 2 pawns there. In addition, if you have 2 pawns next to each other, so let's get rid of this. If you have 2 pawns next to each other, you can make them leapfrog over each other. So like this, if you have 2 pawns right over here, you can move them right over here. If you have multiple pawns, like this, there's a pawn on h9, goes all the way to k9. You can move from h9 to l9, leapfrogging 3 squares over. And that is also legal. Rule C tells you how you capture enemy pawns. So we have A over here. There is one ready pawn in A, and there is one ready pawn in B. This is a situation where A cannot move into B because there is an equal amount of pawns. However, if B was vulnerable, it only counts as 0.67 of a pawn, or roughly 2/3 of a pawn. So in that case, A would be allowed to move in and eliminate pawn B. The second situation that changes how much a pawn is worth is if a pawn is being flanked. In that case, B would be worth half of a pawn, and A would be free to move in, remove pawn B. The third situation is you just have more pawns. So let's say there were 2 pawns here as A, and B only had 1 pawn. A could move in both of the pawns in and capture the 1B pawn. That's about all for things that I think I actually need to explain. For the rest of it, you can just ask me questions. That's all. See ya.